Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me is another first time author making their first time appearance on the show. Now, my guest was born in Germany, but grew up in Michigan. They still have family over in Germany and still keep in touch with them. Family was in the military, specifically her dad. And throughout her childhood, she played soccer, shot archery, as well as wrestled growing up. And ever since fourth grade, she's always wanted to write her own story. Later in life, she joined the military where she met her husband on deployment. And in 2013, they had their first son together, and they now live in North Carolina, which is about half an hour from the beach, which honestly is perfect. And in this episode, we'll be talking about Wrath of the Raya. I probably butchered that, so I apologize in advance, viewers and listeners. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest this morning, author Sabrina Roznowski. Sabrina, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem, Sabrina. So, before we go into your novel, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners?
Well, if you have a dream, go after it. Even if you don't feel like you can do it, the people surrounding you will support you and push you to finish your timeline or goals or anything that you have set. So it's a family, friends and family effort rather than just one person. So if you feel like you're ready to give up, don't, because there will be others that can pick up the slack for you.
Awesome. That is very, very beautiful. And honestly, that kind of is almost like an answer for like the final question, what's your word of wisdom? So you kind of just skipped ahead, but I absolutely love it. So let's actually talk about your book as a little teaser for people now just learning about this novel. What can you tell us about it?
It's a coming of age story for a girl who's from an almost Amazon like tribe of all women. And she's kind of naive in the way of the world because they don't really have much interaction with men or the rest of the world. She ends up meeting the second son of the tyrant king, who's nothing like the royal family. And between the two of them, they have to navigate through rebellion and survival, and they have to sacrifice a lot in order to fight for freedom, not just for themselves, but for the rest of the continent.
Nice. Very, very nice. I absolutely love it. Now, let's actually talk about the name. How did the name of the book come about? Because I absolutely love it, as well as the cover. How did that all come about?
I'm very big into Greek mythology and medieval time frames, and I really always did love the Amazons. So that's partially where that came from. The weapons, the training, the fact that no one thought that they could do it just because they were women. It kind of had a culture all of its own, and it was really intriguing. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Nice. Now, before we dive more into the creation of this book, let's actually talk a little bit more about you and your childhood. So, from your bio, you've had an amazing childhood. You did a lot of amazing things. You began writing in fourth grade and been in the military, which is incredible. So, you've been doing a lot. So, growing up, were you always a creative child, or did that creativity come about later in the sense of like something sparked this creativity?
No, I always was the one with my nose in a book or coloring or writing something. Always something to do with making jewelry or friendship bracelets or something.
All right, all right. Now, what would you consider your aha moment? The moment where you decided that you want to create your own story.
Well, I started trying to write things as early as fourth grade, and they were not very good. So I kind of backed out of it for a little bit. And then one of my friends in middle school said, "Hey, there's this thing called NaNoWriMo, where you write your novel in a month. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let me try that. And so I got my first fan fiction out of a NaNoWriMo, and we went from there.
Nice, very, very nice. A lot of authors I've had on the show have said that NaNoWriMo was another avenue for them to begin their writing, which is awesome. I love that. And also, I just love to mention that you a lot of that, for some of us, that's where, we began. We began writing fan fiction of our favorite stories and wanted to give our own spin to it, which I absolutely love. So now let's actually talk about the creation of the book, Sabrina. So walk me through it. So you're sitting at your computer, or maybe you have a notepad in your hand. What were the goals you had going into this book, as well as the promises you're making to your future readers?
Well, I do write in a notebook. I happen to love pens and notebooks, preferably to computers any day. Technology and don't really get along that well. But I wanted to have characters that people could relate to. I always felt the books I read were amazing, but I felt like the characters were more than what I could be. So I wanted to scale it down a little bit to where it could be anybody in the story.
All right, all right. And so, once you began writing this story, I'm curious, did you have an outline of how the story wanted to go? Or did you sort of just write it as, an idea came about? I guess it's the discussion of like, a planner versus a plotter.
Definitely seat of my pantser. This was originally meant to be one book, and then it was turned into a trilogy. So now that I do have the second and third ones also in the works, those are being planned. But the first one was more of a sit down and write what comes to you.
Ah, okay. Very nice. Very nice. So after you finished writing, or as a drafting the first draft of your novel, what was the reaction like from friends and family? Or rather, when did you let friends and family know that you were writing your first book? And what was the initial response like?
Well, I did let them know, I want to say maybe about a third of the way through it, but I didn't talk about it very much because sometimes I procrastinate and I don't really finish things. That's also part of the imposter syndrome that comes to anybody who writes.
Mm-hmm.
But they've helped push, and my husband and my best friend were the ones telling me every day, like, you can do it. You need to sit there. You need to finish it. You're not going to just sit there and leave it be. It deserves to be finished, and you need to keep going.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So now I'm curious, did you do any beta reads and arc reads for this first book? And just like the previous question, what was the response like? Very positive, very critical, or somewhere down the middle?
Very encouraging. I did have a couple of people beta read it as I was going, and then I made changes. And then at the very end, I had um, two people go over it with editing, and it was pretty good response. My husband and friend didn't want to read it until it was finished because they didn't want to be, have all the different thought processes from the different manuscript versions all at once in their head. So they waited till it was finished, but it was very,
Mm,
very positive when I was finished with it.
that's good. That's very good. And I love how, a lot of us authors are using, beta reads and arc reads because that leads into and the next question, which comes into mind, which is, this vulnerability that whenever we write our first books, we are hesitant to share it with people like outside of our immediate friend group or immediate family. Because, when we write our first book, there is a part of us that's attached to it. And especially now in the digital age, that can be amplified even more. And when we go about publishing our first book, it's a double edged sword. Yes, social media can be a great tool for us authors to reach new readership. But on the other side of the coin, we expose ourselves and leave ourselves open to attacks, critiques, uh, you know, hate speech, anything, and that could be hugely detrimental to an author's confidence and self worth. And as you mentioned before, Sabrina, imposter syndrome is always going to be there for us authors in the back of our mind, saying that we're not good enough, no one's going to read this, why are you wasting your time, and so forth. So I'm curious, Sabrina, during the process of writing this book, did you have those moments of imposter syndrome or heightened anxiety? And if so, or if not, what disciplined you to not only finish the first book, but also make the commitment to make this into a series and begin book two and three?
Yes, I definitely had that in the back of my mind, sometimes in the forefront of my mind. And it took my husband and my friend pushing me to tell me, don't quit, don't let it win. And it took a lot of trying to change my mindset in order for me to actually get it finished.
All right, all right. Now, here's another question leading into that, which now I'm going to talk a little bit about books two and book three, just sparingly. I know this term is always used to describe movies, but I definitely think it also applies to books, sequelitis, where the sequel may not live up to the hype or may exceed the hype of the first project. Did that ever come into mind when writing book two and book three? Or another question to that, as you mentioned before, you just started off as writing, this as a standalone novel. At what point did you realize that because of the world you created, it needed more books to help flesh out the story?
Well, it was more of my friend who has she's a little more savvy when it comes to the market and how thick books should be. And she was the one that said, you should probably break this up because there's so much more story to tell than what you've already shown. So I definitely defer to her on that one. And I'm not so worried about the sequelitis part because I feel like it's all one story, whereas it's not a new story in each one. It's just, oh, okay, this is where I happen to put the book down today, or this is where I put in my bookmark today. So it still feels like one continuous book.
Ah, okay. So almost like in like Lord of the Rings in the sense where it's one encompassing story, one encompassing journey. It's just, book two and book three are just, different parts of the journey as opposed to it's a new story, new journey with possibly new characters.
Correct.
All right, nice. Now, this is a question I really want to ask you, Sabrina, before we get into the business portion of the interview, because I definitely feel, it's a very interesting question. Now, a previous guest of mine, Jasmine Young, posted this on her social talking about the golden age of indie authors. And a lot of my guests that I've had on the show, and I've been doing the show for 6 years now, all of them have began writing their stories around 2019, the height of COVID, quarantine, and lockdown. And so many new and amazing authors emerged from that. And it did, make me wonder, like, is that truly the birth of the golden age? And in my opinion, I think it is. But what are your thoughts on this, Sabrina? Do you think there is, or do you think that there was a golden age that came out during those 4 years?
I would say that yes and no. Yes, in the
Okay.
sense because people who had those stories inside them had the chance to sit down and bring them out to share with other people. And no, particularly for that time frame, because the stories were always there, so it wouldn't have mattered when they came out, they would have still had that same success, I feel.
That's a very interesting point to look at because you're absolutely right. A lot of people probably did have those stories with them as opposed to, creating a story right then and there. That is actually a very interesting point to look at. Thank you for that, Sabrina. So now let's actually talk about the business side of your book as well as its sequels. So, Sabrina, when you made the decision to publish your book, what direction did you decide to go with? And Looking back on it, would you have gone a different direction in publishing?
Well, I actually lucked into a small publishing company because I had made friends with an editor. It used to be a hybrid publishing house, and I was using the editing side, and it got absorbed into the traditional publishing part. But unfortunately, with COVID and everything,
Hmm.
things slowed down. So the the publishing company had to shut down, and then I had to start over with indie publishing, which I kind of feel like I've had the spread of both ends of the spectrum as far as the publishing goes. And I feel they both have their merits. If you can get a publishing contract, definitely go for it. But also, if you are an indie author, you have more control over what you want to put out and where you can put it out.
Absolutely, 100%. I definitely think, not a lot of people really take into account like this side of the publishing world when it comes to, the direction. Yes, everyone has their own direction when it comes to publishing their stories, but there's a lot of research that goes into like what house and what style of publishing works best for you, because one book may be, let's say, independently published, but then your second book may be traditionally published. And you really have to consider, the amount of time and effort that goes into these decisions. You're absolutely right, Sabrina, that for independent publishing, we have the creative control, but it's a lot of out of pocket where we have to pay for the editors, we have to pay for the cover artists, we have to pay for the printing service unless we go through like Amazon KDP and Barnes and Noble. And we go traditional and hybrid. Well, traditional especially, you have to create a query letter. You really have to sell yourself to this publishing house to take them or for them to take you seriously. And that is a hassle in and of itself. So all these different decisions have to be taken into consideration. Now, what is your thought on? I talked to a lot of guests on this discussion of gatekeeper mentality in the publishing industry. In your opinion, Sabrina, does it exist and is it harmful to beginning authors, first time authors?
Oof. Well, I had actually not thought of that before, and showing my newness, not quite sure what the gatekeeper mentality is as far as the indie publishing goes.
Of course, of course. So the gatekeeper mentality, as talking with a lot of authors, is okay, well, this applies mainly to traditional publishing, where you have these gatekeepers in the sense that they, are very limited in the new books they take into consideration, like HarperCollins, Macmillan, Penguin Random House, Tor, Forge, because yes, for them they are businesses and they have to take these books that are going to make them money into consideration. With that being said, it is very difficult for, first time authors to get into traditional publishing if that's the way they want to go. Because of these gatekeepers who, only allow certain books or certain types of books from certain types of authors to get through. And it can be very deflating. So that is what I mean by the gatekeeper mentality.
Gotcha. Yeah. I would feel like they do know the business better. They do know what they will and will not let in. So if you don't have an agent or a query letter that works for them, then it's very easy to get overlooked. But that does not mean it should be a deterrent.
Absolutely 100%. And I also like to mention in this part of the interview that for authors looking into traditional publishing, look into small traditional houses or small independent traditional houses, because I've had a lot of authors who have had amazing experiences with these small publishing houses, and no one really takes them into consideration because, of course, they're smaller. They're not like the big ones on the East Coast. However, sometimes these smaller houses have a greater rapport with their audience, with the readership, than sometimes the big ones. But ultimately, It's whatever decision the person wants to make. So now let's actually talk about the audience and the readership of the book. So, Sabrina, when you began writing your book, did you have an audience in mind? And do you have a good idea of your audience now going into book two and book three?
I did have an audience in mind. My son's going to be 12 in April, and I was hoping to try to find something to get him into reading. So I thought maybe if I made a story that I felt was interesting enough, he would get into it and his friends that he goes to school with. But I'm also the type of adult who reads YA fantasy all the time. And I also know what I'm looking for in that particular genre. So between those two images is what I try to keep in my head as I was writing it.
Absolutely. And I just want to make a little tangent comment is that you're probably the what was it? The third author I've had on the show who has said that they want to create something for their kids to read, which will then lead to another very interesting question when he talks about the readership. But before we get to that, in your opinion, Sabrina, when should an author take into account their audience? Now, some people I've had on the show have said that they thought of their audience during the initial drafting phase of their book, but others have argued that they consider their audience when they published it and were now marketing their book. Where do you fall in between those two?
I feel to be 100% accurate, you would wait till the end because once the book is written, you know exactly what is in it and how far that will reach to the audience, if it's age appropriate for the audience you had in mind to begin with or not. I did think ahead though and try to keep it to something that would keep the interest of a 12-year-old to maybe like 18-year-old.
Mm.
So it's not as spicy as some of the other young adult fantasy books. It's clean. It's more about friendships as opposed to relationships that in a romantic way.
Absolutely. And that actually segues perfectly into the next question, which is, of course, understanding the readership. Because while the audience is a very, very, broad category, the readership, the individual readers, those are the people that we as authors are trying to market towards. And in the readership category, we have the three big groups: YA, NA, and AF, adult fiction. And each reading group category has their own set of rules that authors have to adhere to and follow. And sometimes it could be a challenge, especially for YA. And I know a lot of authors who have written YA, they've noticed that, some books in the YA category, upon reading them, need to possibly be recategorized as either NA or AF because the material in it is not age appropriate, which that comes with fine tuning and really honing your craft as an author. So, Sabrina, when you began writing your book, was that the category or the age group you were initially from the get-go planning to write for, or were you just writing your first book just to write it and get it out there, but then when you decided to publish it, you went back and re-edited it so that way it would fit in the appropriate age category?
No, I started with YA from the beginning. I wanted to make sure it fell underneath that radar of possibly becoming NA to AF.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. And in your opinion, what have you learned about being a YA author? Because I've had a lot of authors who have learned, a lot of new things about being YA in terms of, what words to use, how to approach certain themes that you couldn't necessarily do in NA or AF. So, for you, what have you learned about being a YA author?
I've learned that you really want to focus on the relationship, non-romantic relationships between the characters in order to make sure that it's not like a forced proximity romance or something that doesn't initially work but then ends up working later. It's something where they kind of have to build off of each other from the beginning so that the relationship will always start out as being in a good light.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that a lot of guests have talked on the show with me is that when writing YA characters, there is sort of like this struggle to write, believable and relatable young characters, especially for YA. And it can be a little bit of a challenge because for me, myself, I dabbled in YA and I found it difficult because most of the characters that I usually write in my other stories are like 20 to like mid 20s, almost the same age as me. And it's difficult for me as an author to write a character that is younger than myself and really trying to understand like how they would view the world. So when you began writing your characters, was that a little bit of a struggle for you or was it easier for you?
I think it was easier for me because I was in the house constantly with someone that is close to that age group. So I had his social cues to go off of and to incorporate.
All right, nice, very nice. So now let's actually talk about another question which I love asking my guests, and that's of course the balancing of individuality with familiarity. And what I mean by that, Sabrina, is that as authors, we want to showcase our individuality in our works. But with that said, we also want our works to be very familiar, to draw upon the inspirations of books that we've grown up reading. And I definitely feel as authors that is a it's a juggling situation because we want to be perfect, want to be in sync. We don't want to lead into one side or the other. Yes, we want to show our individuality, our originality, but we also want our stories to be very familiar and have our readers sort of make that internal connections like, oh, this reminds me of this, or hey, he's almost like this. So, how did you go about balancing these two for your book series?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, with it being one continuous book just broken up, I kind of tried to keep in that Lord of the Rings focus as far as its more modern quest for younger people, because there is a journey and a prophecy in there where they have to go and acquire a talisman. So that was kind of paralleled a little bit to the epic journey. And as far as the relationships and the characters, I have had some people tell me that it's like the relationships between Katniss and Peeta in the Hunger Games. So they do end up forming an unlikely friendship and being able to help each other grow while they're learning to become other people.
All right, all right. And as a follow up to that question, I know that you may have seen a lot of books that have had the tagline "so and so meets so and so." One book to me that comes to mind when I see that is the late Victor Milan's Dinosaur Night series, which reviewers and editors and fellow authors have described it as the love child of Jurassic Park and Game of Thrones. Now, I've never read either of those books, but I had an idea of what each of those books were about. And upon reading it, it's exactly what I expected. However, 99% of the time, that's not necessarily a good thing because it pigeonholes us into, one style of writing, one way to present characters, or unrealistic expectations that we shouldn't be pigeonholed into a box or a checklist. Yes, we want to write in the genre that we are familiar and comfortable with, but we shouldn't be restricted to just that genre. So we should be allowed to write in different genres, cross genre authors, as I like to use. So, Sabrina, what is your thoughts on this discussion? And in your opinion, is it harmful or helpful to an author?
I believe cross genre is a good thing. If, for example, you try something from an author that you absolutely like, you're going to try to look into what else they have. If it's something completely different and you like it, then you have just found a genre that you never thought you could like before, possibly, or that you never wanted to explore before. And then now you have a segue into it from someone that you already admire their writing to help you find new things.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads into another discussion, which is very, very prevalent in the publishing community, which is, of course, trends and tropes. Now, tropes are always going to be a part of the storytelling process. There's no denying it. But there is a difference when you have these tropes that come about naturally, as opposed to you're writing a story that needs to have all these tropes. One example is, we see on Instagram, all of these books that have like these tropes that are attached to it, and it's supposed to get the reader's engagement. And it may, but it's like, what's the plot? What's the actual story about? And they can't even like honestly tell us what the plot is. So, Sabrina, what is your experiences with writing tropes and trends in your book? And in your opinion, how detrimental is it to write for tropes or trends in the publishing industry, as opposed to just writing a story naturally that just has these tropes and trends organically weaved through?
The way I wrote it, I was not trying to keep tropes and trends in my mind as I was going. It sort of kind of happened naturally as I was writing. And then I looked at it and went, oh, okay, well, it can fit into this trope and it can fit into this trope because this is how the story is going. This is who my character is. This is how they act. So it was purely by accident that it came into those tropes. I did not specifically set out to make the story fit into that.
Absolutely, 100%. And I definitely think that's probably the best way to use, tropes is that, again, as I said before, viewers and listeners, tropes are always going to come about in writing one way or another, and that's absolutely fine. It's a different thing entirely when you're trying to force a trope into your story that doesn't necessarily make sense because it's going to feel non-organic and artificial, and your readers are going to pick it up. And this leads into a very important question, which brace yourself, Sabrina, because this is a long question, or rather has a lot of context to it. So, as I've mentioned before, I've been doing podcasting now for 6 years. And with this episode, I've interviewed 124 authors from indie, traditional, hybrid, the works. And it's been incredible. I've learned a lot from all of these amazing authors. They've given me so much. And one of the best piece of advice that I've ever gotten from a guest is this hard truth. But before I tell that hard truth, to lead up to that, I've learned in this publishing industry that there are two paths for us: to be an author and to be known as an author. One is dedicated to storytelling, the other is dedicated to marketing. Now, both paths have their own trials and hurdles, but definitely for first time authors getting into this industry with their first book and wanting to make money off of it, the second path is the most enticing. But I'm going to tell you this right now, viewers and listeners, this is not a get rich quick scheme. This is not an easy money maker. It is long hours, it's a hustle, it's a grind. A lot of authors sometimes take years to create their first book. And this leads to the hard truth, which is in the publishing industry, there is no guarantee your debut novel is going to be the start of your legacy as an author. But there are exceptions to the rule, of course. There are many authors whose first books did give them that status. But generally speaking, you have these highs and lows, and that can be very deflating for first time authors. I've had one guest on the show who said that they had a friend go into this industry with the wrong intentions. Within 3 weeks, their passion for writing plummeted. So, Sabrina, I turn over to you to hear your thoughts on this topic and this discussion in the publishing industry that, yes, there is no guarantee that your book is going to be an overnight success. It's a 50-50 chance. But that shouldn't stop you from honing your craft of being a writer if this is truly the industry you want to be a part of.
I 100% agree with that. I've seen Facebook groups for successful writers, and they will be the first ones to tell you that they still have imposter syndrome. It took them 20 to 30 different times reaching out before they could get published, looking at J.K. Rowling or uh, Stephen King even had, I think,
Mhm.
40 some odd ones before he was published under his original name. And it's hard to take the punches and keep going and still try to keep your upbeatness about your love for your craft, your writing, your stories. It is hard. I won't lie about that. But if you have a good support system around you, then that's all it is. It's a hit and you keep on going. You put a band-aid on it and you keep moving. You have that support around you. You have that drive. Sometimes there's going to be bad days. You're going to hit writer's block. There's going to be days where you're crying because you cannot get something to work you want the way you want it to. But then you step back, you'll be driving down the road and all of a sudden it'll work itself out in your head, or you'll have a dream and it'll fix itself. And you wake up in the morning and you're scribbling down that scene so you don't forget it. And it is a journey. I saw in one of those groups where an author, in order to try to have a living come from it, has to have at least 20 published books plus marketing or more in order to make a living off of it. And if that's coming from successful authors and you're an indie author just starting out, you're not quite there yet. The work has to come in first before you can sit back and rest.
Absolutely, 100%. That's almost the same piece of advice I got from a fellow author that I met at the LA Festival of Books. Shout out to Natalie, right, for giving me this information, which is it may be your seventh book that really gets your name out there. And it's a hard pill to swallow for, any authors going into this industry for the first time, but it's true. Your first book is a 50-50 chance it's going to be a success. Now, it will get your foot in the door, but to get you everything you want, that takes time and that takes a lot of refinement. And when you do write that book, that really gets your name out there, then you can say, if you enjoyed this book, check out my other ones. Because grit transforms into talent as time goes on. We only get better. And as you were saying before, Sabrina, like having a good support group is very, very impactful for authors. And that leads into the next discussion, which is, of course, networking as authors, because networking is a huge asset for us authors, especially on social media. There are so many indie authors, so many writing groups, so many author groups that can support us in our endeavors, and we in turn can help their members as well. So, Sabrina, are there any people you would like to give a personal shout out to who have helped you on this journey of yours, from either fellow authors, editors, author groups, a particular person, anyone in particular?
I actually met my best friend through one of a Facebook groups that I mentioned called Moms Who Write, and she has her own. She's got 3 series now that she's doing, and we're working on possibly doing collabs together for
Ooh,
right. And we're going to be putting a pen name on the one for us together. And her name is AC Dawn. She also has fantasy. She does her romance under Andy Carly. And if I didn't have her to help me along, to help push, I would not have learned as much as I have about making sure to keep my themes the way they should be, keeping my tropes the way they are, and actually being able to label those tropes correctly so that they fit into my story. My husband has always been there for me. Even when I don't believe in me, he does. And that really helps keep me going 100%.
beautiful, Sabrina. Absolutely beautiful. And as we reach the final question for this amazing author interview, here it is. So, with everything you've learned thus far on your author journey, from writing and publishing book one to working on book two and book three, the struggles and the hurdles that came along with it, and the connections that you've made as well, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors who are watching and are listening to this interview right now?
Don't stop. Even when you have that imposter syndrome, even when you feel like you can't make it as big as, let's say, Fourth Wing or Throne of Glass or the other books in the genre that made you want to write, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be as big. If it's your story and you want it to get it out there, you've got to finish it. You've got to put it out there. You've got to let other people enjoy it the way that you want them to enjoy it. It doesn't have to be all the people, it has to be the right people.
Beautifully said, Sabrina. Beautifully said. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another amazing author interview here on the channel. I want to give a huge thank you to Sabrina for coming out on the show, making her official debut on the channel. Hopefully, this won't be the last time we see her. Hopefully, she'll be back to tell us about book 2 and book 3 of her series. And speaking of which, Sabrina, where can people find your book series on the internet as well as follow you on social media?
On Amazon, Barnes and Noble, they both have them on their website. There are, um, if you need signed copies, you can reach out to me on my Facebook page, which is Sabrina Roznowski, author. Or there's a small shop here in my town that I supply them to called the Lazy Daisy Bookshop that has signed copies.
Excellent. I'll provide all those links down below in the description of this video for you to go and check out. And as always, viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us for another amazing, incredible author interview. Again, a huge thank you to Sabrina for coming out here on the show. We wish her the very best going forward into books 2 and books 3, and possibly maybe a fourth book or maybe a spin-off of her series. Just make sure to follow her on social media to stay up to date. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And until next time, have a wonderful evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world.